I had built First West Bank from nothing, literally nothing. 20 years ago, I was a junior loan officer making $35,000 a year, eating ramen in a studio apartment in downtown Atlanta. I watched the men around me get promotions, watched them get the good accounts, watched them get invited to client lunches while I was left to process paperwork in the basement. So I stopped waiting. I started my own consulting firm on nights and weekends, built a client base, got my MBA from Georgia State, and by 35, I had enough capital and connections to launch my own financial institution. First West Bank. My name on the charter, my vision on the wall. By the time I was 47, First West had 3 branches, 140 employees, and was handling over $200 million in assets. I was the first black female CEO of a major regional bank in the Southeast. I'd been on the cover of Atlanta Business Journal. I'd spoken at Harvard. My mother cried when she saw my corner office on the 52nd floor of the Peachtree Center. A woman who'd raised me alone on a nurse's salary, who'd taught me that excellence was the only thing they couldn't take from you. But they tried. God, how they tried. The morning it happened, I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports, the Georgia sun already brutal against the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a Thursday in late August, the kind of humid, suffocating heat that makes the city smell like hot asphalt and possibility. My assistant, Marcus, had already brought me my second espresso. I'd cut back to 2 a day since my cardiologist's lecture, and I was deep in the numbers when my phone buzzed. "Ashley, we need to talk," the text read. It was from Richard Vance, our board chairman. Not, "Let's grab coffee," or "Do you have a minute?" Just that. The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. He was typing something else. Then nothing. The bubbles stopped. I set the phone down and told myself it was nothing. Richard had been acting strange for weeks, sure, vague about certain committee decisions, suddenly concerned about my travel expenses, which were standard industry practice, asking pointed questions about my salary and bonus structure. But Richard had been on my board since day one. He'd been at my 50-acre farm wedding to David 4 years ago. He knew my mother. He'd held my hand when David and I went through fertility treatments that didn't take. I went back to the reports. At 11:45, there was a knock on my door. Not Marcus. The knock was different, heavier, official. When I looked up, I saw 3 people. Richard, looking at his shoes, Sandra Chen from our legal department looking at her phone, and Thomas Whitmore, who I recognized as an outside counsel we'd never hired, looking directly at me with an expression that made my stomach drop. "Ashley, we need to ask you to step down," Richard said quietly. I set my pen down. Slowly. My hands were steady, which surprised me. The espresso cup was still warm. "Excuse me?" "The board has made a decision. Effective immediately, you're to hand over your office access, your company phone, and your badge. We'll discuss the terms of your departure with legal representation present." "Richard, what are you talking about?" I stood up. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. "What decision? There was no board meeting. There was a special session last night. Closed session. 7-1 with you abstained." 7-1. I did the math in my head. 9 board members total. I had been friendly with 4 of them, friendly with 2 others, neutral with the remaining 3. On what grounds? My voice came out steady, and I was grateful for that. I was grateful for my mother's blood in me, her nurse's calm in the face of crisis. "We can have counsel explain the details," Thomas Whitmore said, finally speaking. His tone was practiced, professional, the voice of a man who'd done this before. "But there are serious governance concerns, financial irregularities, and we need to conduct an audit before we can discuss your severance." Financial irregularities. The words hung in the air like poison gas. "I want to know what irregularities," I said, "because I review these books every single day. I know every deposit, every withdrawal, every loan we've underwritten." "That will all come out in the formal audit," Sandra said, still not looking at me. "For now, Marcus will help you collect personal items. A box for photographs and personal effects only. You'll sign the confidentiality agreement before you leave the building." "I'm not signing anything until I speak to my attorney." Richard finally looked at me. In his eyes, I saw something I recognized. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of what came next. Fear of what he'd already agreed to. "Ashley, please don't make this difficult." But I wasn't making it difficult. They were. And I was about to find out just how difficult it could get. Marcus appeared in the doorway. He looked devastated, which meant he'd known something was coming. Security was behind him. 2 men in dark polo shirts with First West logos. "I'll gather my things," I said, and I moved to my desk like a person walking through a dream. The photographs came off the wall first. My mother at my graduation. David on our wedding day. The ribbon-cutting ceremony from the day we opened the Buckhead branch. My hands didn't shake. My breathing stayed even. But in my chest, something had cracked open, and I could feel the cold pouring in. The walk to the elevator was the longest walk of my life. 30 people watched me leave. 30 people who'd worked under me, learned from me, gotten promotions and raises and mentorship from me. No one said anything. No one made eye contact. The only sound was the quiet beep of the security card reader as they deactivated my access. At the bank of elevators on the 52nd floor, Richard tried to speak to me again. "Ashley, I know this is shocking, but..." I held up my hand. "Don't. Whatever you're about to say, don't. You owed me a conversation. You owed me the courtesy of asking me about these irregularities before you decided to humiliate me in front of my staff. You owed me that, Richard, at minimum." The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. Through the closing gap, I saw his face. Guilty, defensive, small. He looked like a man who'd made a choice he couldn't take back. The lobby of First West Bank looked the same as it always had. Marble floors, the logo wall, the customer service desks where 4 tellers I'd personally hired were processing transactions. But it looked different to me now. Foreign. Like a place I'd only visited in dreams and was now waking from. The security guard at the front desk, Marcus's cousin, a good man named Deshawn whom I'd given a job to when he was fresh out of prison, looked at me with shock as I walked past, box in hand. "Miss Ashley? What's—" "It's okay, Deshawn," I said, and I meant it. It would be okay. Because I had already made a decision, standing in that elevator. I had called my attorney before I'd finished collecting my photographs. By the time I reached the parking garage, I had 3 missed calls from my lawyer, Patricia Washington, a woman who'd represented me for the past decade and who, I would later learn, had been waiting for this exact call. I sat in my car in the parking garage of the building I'd built, the building that had my name on a plaque downstairs, and I cried. Not the kind of crying that weakens you, the kind that clarifies, the kind that comes right before you burn everything down. It was 12:47 p.m. on a Thursday. By 5 p.m., Patricia would have already filed a preliminary injunction. By Friday morning, she would know things about my board that they didn't know about themselves. And by Monday, the real war would begin. But that's getting ahead. First, I had to find out what the hell they thought they had on me, and I had to find out who had really done this. Because Richard Vance, weak, frightened Richard, wasn't smart enough to orchestrate this alone. Someone was pulling strings. Someone had been planning this. And they'd made the mistake of thinking I was just another executive they could push out the door. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Part 2. The Reckoning. Patricia Washington called me at 2:47 p.m., before I'd even left the parking garage. I knew her voice well enough to hear the smile in it, even through the phone. "I've already got 3 people on this," she said. "Don't talk to anyone. And Ashley, breathe. They made their first mistake the second they didn't do this face-to-face." I didn't feel like breathing. I felt like burning. But I drove to Patricia's office in Buckhead anyway, box of my life in the passenger seat, and by the time I arrived, she had already pulled together a preliminary timeline. Patricia was a woman in her 60s, sharp as cut glass, with silver locks and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She'd represented me through the bank's initial charter approval, through 2 acquisitions, through my divorce from my first husband, a man who'd tried to convince me that being CEO meant I was too ambitious for marriage. She looked at the documents I'd brought and whistled low. "They're going to regret this," she said quietly. "But first, we need to understand what they think they have. This financial irregularity language is intentionally vague. They're fishing. Or they think they've found something and they're trying to catch you off guard before you can explain it." "I don't have anything to explain," I said. "I know every transaction in that bank." "Then let's find out what they're looking at." She pulled out her phone and made a call. "Marcus Chen? It's Patricia Washington. I need you to subpoena First West's board meeting minutes from the past 18 months, and I need them by end of business tomorrow. She paused. Because my client was just terminated without cause, and we're going to find out exactly why. The next 72 hours were a blur of documents, late nights, and slowly building rage. Marcus Chen, an investigative accountant Patricia had worked with for 15 years, went through First West's books with a microscope. What he found made even Patricia go quiet for a moment. There are transfers, Marcus said, spreading pages across Patricia's conference table. Quarterly transfers from the operating account to a shell company called Meridian Capital Partners, starting 14 months ago. Each transfer between $200,000 and $500,000. That's impossible, I said. I review every transfer over $50,000. Not these you didn't, Marcus said. He pointed to a notation in the margin. They were approved under an emergency authorization protocol, signed by you, Richard Vance, and Sandra Chen. I never signed any emergency authorization. Patricia and Marcus exchanged a look. That's what I thought, Patricia said. Which means someone forged your signature, which is federal fraud, which means they didn't just want you out. They wanted you out and discredited. The pieces started falling into place. Richard Vance had been pushing for an emergency protocol 6 months ago, saying it would allow the bank to move quickly on time-sensitive opportunities. I'd rejected it. But apparently they'd implemented it anyway, and apparently they'd been using it to drain money from my bank for over a year. Who owns Meridian Capital Partners? I asked. Marcus pulled up a screen on his laptop. That's the interesting part. The company was registered with a registered agent in Delaware, but the beneficial owner is listed as Thomas Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore, the outside counsel who'd stood in my office and told me to step down, the man I'd never seen before in my life. He's their lawyer, I said. Why would the board hire a lawyer to represent them in a termination if they weren't preparing for litigation? Or, Patricia said slowly, they hired him because he's already involved in whatever they're doing. Let me find out who else is on Meridian's cap table. It took Patricia's team 48 hours to pull the full ownership structure. When she called me at 6 a.m. on Saturday morning, her voice was tight with the kind of anger that comes from seeing injustice rendered in black and white. Richard Vance owns 40%, she said. Sandra Chen owns 30%. Thomas Whitmore owns 20%. And the remaining 10% belongs to a company called Riverside Holdings, which is owned by someone named David Mercer. I didn't recognize the name. I said so. David Mercer is on your board, Patricia said. He's been there since the beginning. He was brought on through a venture capital firm you trusted. And he's been funneling money out of your bank for 14 months while playing the part of a loyal board member. The room started spinning. 4 people. 4 people I'd trusted, worked with, included in the most intimate decisions about my company's future. 4 people who'd been systematically stealing from me while I was at my desk, reviewing reports, hiring employees, building something they'd never built in their lives. What do they want? I asked. What's the end game? Best case? They panic when they realize we know. Worst case? They're trying to push you out quietly, audit the books on their own timeline, bury the evidence, and sell the bank to someone who won't ask questions. In the chaos of a leadership transition, a lot of things get overlooked. We need to move fast, I said. We're already moving, Patricia said. But we do this right, legally airtight, no shortcuts. When we come down hard enough that they don't get back up. Monday morning, I was in Patricia's office at 8 a.m., dressed in a charcoal suit and diamonds, the armor of a woman who'd already won. We had copies of everything. The forged signatures, the shell company registrations, the wire transfer records, the board minutes from the closed session. We also had something else, something I'd asked Marcus to find, and he had, because he was brilliant and he understood what was really at stake. The bank's charter agreement requires board approval for any transfer over $500,000, Marcus had explained. They can't authorize these transfers legally under the emergency protocol, which means they knew they were breaking the law. They just thought you wouldn't find out. At 8:30 a.m., Patricia called Richard Vance. She put him on speakerphone. Richard, this is Patricia Washington, counsel for Ashley Morrison. I'm going to be very direct. You have until noon today to schedule an emergency board meeting with all 9 members present. Ms. Morrison will be attending. If you refuse, we file for a temporary restraining order and begin litigation for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, breach of contract, and forgery. Your choice. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, Ashley's not welcome at the bank. Then it will be a video call, Patricia said. Noon. All 9 board members, or we see you in federal court. She hung up. At 11:45 a.m., I was sitting in Patricia's conference room with the documents in front of me. My hands were steady. My heart was steady. I'd spent the weekend letting the rage burn clean, and what was left was something harder, a kind of diamond-cut clarity. These people had tried to destroy me. They'd gone into my bank, the thing I'd built from nothing, the thing my mother had cried over, and they'd treated it like a piggy bank to rob while I slept. The video conference started at exactly noon. All 9 board members were there. Richard Vance looked gray. Sandra Chen looked terrified. David Mercer looked confused, the only person in the room, apparently, who wasn't aware that this meeting was about to end his career. Thomas Whitmore was noticeably absent, which told me everything I needed to know about how prepared he was to defend himself. Patricia stood up, composed and lethal. I'm Patricia Washington, counsel for Ms. Ashley Morrison. I'm here to present evidence of systematic fraud perpetrated by members of this board. I'm also here to present Ms. Morrison's formal notice of reinstatement as CEO, pending resolution of these matters through proper legal channels. You can't reinstate her unilaterally, Richard said, but his voice had no power behind it. Watch me, Patricia said. She pulled up the documents on screen. Wire transfers, signatures, side by side with known authentic samples, the shell company registrations, the cap table, the minutes from the closed session where they'd voted to remove me without cause, immediately after securing the emergency protocol authorization that they'd used to steal money. $4.2 million, Patricia said quietly. Transferred over 14 months. From a bank with $200 million in assets under management. Money that belongs to shareholders, to depositors, to employees whose 401ks are investigated in First West's performance. Money that was stolen while the CEO, the person legally responsible for this institution's integrity, was kept in the dark. I watched David Mercer's face, watched the moment he realized he'd been trapped. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Effective immediately, Patricia continued, Ms. Morrison is reinstated as Chief Executive Officer. The board will meet with federal law enforcement within 24 hours, at which point they will present these documents and cooperate fully with any investigation. Richard Vance, Sandra Chen, and David Mercer will resign from the board. Thomas Whitmore will receive formal notice of litigation within the hour. This is insane, Sandra Chen said, her voice climbing. You can't just... Yes, I said. My voice cut through hers like a knife through silk. I can, because I own 31% of this bank, and I have the legal authority to remove board members for cause. Fraud is cause, embezzlement is cause, forgery is cause, and you're all guilty of all 3. I leaned forward and I looked directly at Richard Vance, the man who'd known me for 5 years, who'd been at my wedding, who'd held my hand when I thought my marriage was ending because I was too ambitious. You taught me something, I said. You taught me what happens when you trust people who have a price. You taught me that loyalty is a one-way street, and I was the only one walking it. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to resign. You're going to cooperate with federal investigators. And you're going to spend the next few years explaining to your family why you threw away your reputation for money you couldn't even spend properly. Because you were sloppy, you were arrogant, and you were stupid enough to think that a woman who built a regional bank from nothing wouldn't notice when you stole from her. There was a silence that lasted forever. Then I stood up. Meeting adjourned, I said. Patricia, send the legal notices. Patricia was smiling, the smile of a lawyer who just watched justice render itself in perfect legal sentences. Already done, she said. The call disconnected. What happened next moved fast. Richard Vance's lawyer called within an hour, offering to negotiate. I didn't negotiate. Federal investigators arrived at First West on Tuesday morning with a warrant. By Wednesday, all 4 men had lawyered up. By Friday, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution had the story. First West Bank CEO uncovered $4.2 million fraud, board members arrested. The narrative flipped. I wasn't the executive who'd been thrown out. I was the CEO who'd been betrayed by her own board, who'd discovered the crime, and who'd brought the criminals to justice. My mother called me crying, good tears this time. My board issued a statement apologizing for the governance failures that had allowed the fraud to occur under their watch. 4 new board members were appointed within 2 weeks, all women, all with credentials that made the previous board look like children playing dress-up. The shareholders' lawsuit settled for a confidential amount that was enough to compensate for the stolen funds plus damages. Thomas Whitmore's law firm dropped him like he was on fire. Richard Vance took a plea deal and agreed to testify against the others in exchange for a lighter sentence. Sandra Chen tried to claim she didn't know what was happening, but the signatures on the transfer authorizations told a different story. David Mercer, the venture capitalist who'd been so good at playing the role of the concerned board member, ended up facing federal charges for wire fraud. 3 months later, I was back in my office on the 52nd floor. The photographs were back on the wall. My mother's face at my graduation. David on our wedding day. But there was a new photograph now, added to the collection. Me, standing in the lobby of First West Bank, surrounded by the new board members, all of us smiling. Not the smile of people who'd won, the smile of people who'd survived. Patricia came by to celebrate. We sat in my office with the city sprawling out below us, and she raised her glass of champagne. "To the women who build things," she said, "and to the men who try to steal them, discovering that theft has consequences." I clinked my glass against hers. "To knowing who to trust," I said, which, as it turns out, is a very short list. "Gets shorter every year," Patricia said. "That's how you know you're getting smarter." That night I drove out to the farm, the 50-acre property where David and I had gotten married, where I'd imagined raising children, where I'd planned to build something lasting. The house was empty. David and I had divorced 5 years ago, amicably, without children, just 2 people who'd wanted different things. I'd kept the property because I loved it and because it was mine. I walked the perimeter in the fading light, my heels clicking against the gravel drive. The land was beautiful in that late summer way, all golden and tired and ready for rest. I thought about Richard Vance, who was probably sitting in a lawyer's office somewhere, watching his life collapse in real time. I thought about Sandra Chen, trying to explain to her family why she'd been fired and arrested. I thought about Thomas Whitmore, whose law career was over, whose reputation was destroyed, whose future was a blank wall. And I didn't feel sorry for any of them. What I felt was something cleaner, something like justice, something like power that hadn't come from a title or a desk or a charter document. It came from the willingness to fight back, from the refusal to accept that being thrown out meant being defeated, from knowing, in my bones, that excellence really was the only thing they couldn't take from me, because it lived inside me, not outside. I stood in the center of the property I owned, under the stars coming out one by one, and I understood something my mother had been trying to teach me my whole life. The only people worth trusting are the ones who've already proven they're willing to fight for you. Everyone else is just borrowing your time. The stars were so bright that night, so sharp and clear and honest, and for the first time in months, I breathed without feeling like my chest was being crushed. I had won. The bank was secure. The criminals were facing justice, and I was still standing. That was enough. That was everything.